Yeah, I I enjoyed that. I have I was under a lot of scrutiny um by agents against justice. That's what I'll call them. Agents against justice, agents against equality, and people who were jealous of petty things, uh, who saw or thought that I was attempting to ascend to a certain position or certain positions, or that I was trying to influence certain or manipulate certain things to work in my favor, so that I can get myself to a certain place. But the one thing that I have been firm on and unflinching on, even in times when I stood alone, was that I cannot go anywhere if I don't have an inclusive nature, not only in my way of thinking, but in my way of structuring my thinking, in how I perceive the future, how I perceive the present, and as well as how I perceive the past. When I look at the past, I don't look at the past and take certain individuals and specialize them above others. I look at each uh, group's contributions, their circumstances, why they had to do what they had to do, how they are living with the circumstances. And this gives me clear insight when I look ahead and when I look at the present. It gives me clear insight into how certain mechanisms work. And these are basically human nature and human behaviors. So they are human expectations. And these human expectations, due to, we came from monarch systems and we have come to democratic systems, and now our constitution was amended, and as the president-elect said, so that it's not top heavy, right? So that not so much uh, responsibility is allocated only on the president, so that the bottom can be able to so that he can delegate better. Basically, that's why the constitution was amended, and a lot of people were against this. I guess most people didn't understand it, and the articulation of it wasn't that clear. But these sort of amendments are amendments that are a must for progress. They are for progress for current leaders and for the leaders to come. So, when it comes to dates, right? This is something that caught my attention. A comrade mentioned dates, and we have special dates. We have Christmas, which is, it originates from a pagan tradition which had absolutely nothing to do with Jesus' birth as it's celebrated today. We have Valentine's Day, which is romanticized, but it wasn't a romantic act. As a matter of fact, he was an old age activist who died in prison for his beliefs, right? And because his death was to an extent an injustice, there had to be a lot of methodology made to cover up for that injustice, right? So, and then you look at our independence. And today, while I decided I was going to watch NBC, and they were talking about trauma. When they spoke of trauma, most of the time, they were speaking about the trauma that soldiers face, as well as the treatment. There were social workers, and there was a clinical psychologist, right? What was missing is very vital: a psychiatrist. Because when people suffer from post traumatic stress, they should be on medication that specifically treats post-traumatic stress. Counseling, right? The counseling, the counseling facilitates, right? So at a certain point, the soldier might not need to take the medication anymore, but it's needed to stabilize the situation at that moment. While this person is going through counseling, where their mindset is being changed and how they think is being changed, they are basically being reprogrammed. When you look at America, which is like the king of wars, one of the things that they have is a lot of psychiatrists. A lot of American soldiers suffer from post-traumatic stress, and a lot of American soldiers are on post-traumatic stress medication. As a matter of fact, the American government has taken it upon itself, and I'm talking about the military wing, to try and make medication that is much more effective and methodologies that are much more effective to treat this problem, because it's harder than most people think. You would have someone waking up thinking they're in a war zone, literally thinking they're in a war zone and acting like that. Most soldiers go off their medication. When they go off their medications, the symptoms go back and they relapse. There's such a term, relapse. I think this was missing, and it's very, very vital, right? I think it's important to inform people about trauma, but we shouldn't bundle up trauma as one thing, right? There are people who are civilians, and then there are people who are soldiers. Soldiers had to kill, civilians were killed, and some civilians survived. There is a difference in that. You are transformed when you take a human life. Something changes, something that has to be overcome, and it takes a lot of time. And a lot of people did not know, did not understand why they were in the position they were, or why they were on the side that they were, until after independence. After independence, as it is clear, most people realized, oh, apartheid was actually a bad thing. There was a minority that fought against it, and a majority that celebrated it. And then when it was demolished, all of a sudden, the minority goes to where their hands are clean. I mean, the majority goes to the minority where their hands are clean, right? And then the minority that fought and sacrificed their lives all of a sudden become heroes. So I don't know why these points were not raised. They are very crucial. And this is coming from, I read a lot of journals on psychology and psychiatry, and especially the effects that war has on soldiers, the effect that war has on soldiers, and the effect that it has on civilians is not the same, right? Um, most soldiers suffer from severe post-traumatic stress. And I heard post-traumatic stress being bundled up with OCD, which is completely different. How would someone develop OCD from being a former soldier? That doesn't make sense, right? It clearly doesn't. So that over with, I want to sort of keep this short. I'm in a good mood, I'm in a thinking mood, and I have thoughts. And the thing that I touched on about dates, right? Dates for independence, dates for this, deadlines are very crucial when it comes to important matters. The year begins in January 1st and it ends in December. That's a deadline. At no point will someone say, no, let us extend this year to January the 5th. That's a deadline. And as the doctor said, that's common sense. Independence, that's a deadline. Do people say, let's extend it to June because we couldn't do ABC? No, there's a deadline. Deadlines are crucial. Deadlines are crucial because they set up a much needed gate, a much needed place, that actually a distance that has to be traveled in order to say you have reached your destination. You cannot travel half the way and say you have reached your destination. Then you're lying. That's the same with deadlines. So when you set up a deadline, you are not making a threat. You are basically saying this is the date that you are expected to complete a certain task. This happens in businesses all the time. In many workplaces, there are deadlines. As a matter of fact, a lot of people are unhappy when they walk past 5 because 5 o'clock is the time that they knock off. Why? 5 o'clock is the deadline. So when you're working until 9 o'clock past your deadline, you are clearly unhappy. Unless you're a workaholic and you enjoy your work like a few, but most are unhappy. That's a deadline. So how can a deadline be a threat? A deadline isn't a threat. A deadline is a necessity. A deadline is a sure sign of organization. If there is no deadline, then there is no real organization. Vision 2030 is a deadline. And that shows that there was actually planning involved. And then the deadline was set to make sure that the pressure is on, that the people do what they have to do to reach their deadline. When you're constructing a building, there is a deadline. People work to meet their deadline. The most efficient people put up deadlines and they work to meet their deadlines. Most people have their own daily schedules on what time they do this, what time they do this, what time they do. Those are deadlines. It's a sign of responsibility. So the question would actually be, if there wasn't a deadline, it would be very irresponsible. But what's happening here is irresponsibility is actually being shown on the other end that cannot meet deadlines. Because there were no deadlines, there was a time to lazy about for 25 years. Because there were no deadlines, the willing buyer, willing seller did not work. The willing buyer, willing seller was not a pressure system. There was no pressure applied on it because there were no deadlines. There is no sense of urgency. And urgency is a much needed factor. There has to be urgency. When the news doesn't start at 8, a reason is given because that deadline has been missed. It just doesn't happen that on a day the news is at 3 o'clock and there's absolutely no explanation. The schedules of when what plays, what plays, what plays, what plays. Those are deadlines. A, a deadline is not a threat. A deadline is assigning accountability. And who is accountable? The people that are accountable should say why they cannot meet that deadline. And if they say they cannot meet that deadline due to certain reasons, then they should be called to order as to why they cannot plan ahead, why they cannot plan themselves, think themselves out of those situations. People have been suffering too long for us to not have deadlines. Deadlines are crucial. When something is being released and there is a deadline, right, there is a sense of urgency. Not everyone is born with a sense of urgency. Hence, people notice this, that not everyone is born with a sense of urgency. Look at Ford, the way he innovated to mass produce cars, to meet a certain quantity, to make it cheaper. This all started with a ringer in his head. Deadlines. For one, it takes too long to make a car when you are using this method. Right? I think most business people know this. Hence, a deadline for most creative people is a sure sign of creativity. When you have a deadline, it's time to think. How are you going to meet this deadline? What do you have to do? So if you're unprepared, just like when someone is unprepared for an examination, they study on the day that they're supposed to write the next day, and they lack the aptitude, intellect, and knowledge, then obviously they haven't reached they reach that deadline, and what happens? It collapses. Right? So a lot of it's an intimidating factor. The deadline set, to a lot of people, it's an intimidating factor because they haven't faced something like this before. But this is something that should have been done a long time ago. This deadline should have been set a long time ago. And I think this deadline is very forgiving, even. It's a very forgiving deadline, right? Because this awakening of our entire country, will not be stopped due to intimidation, due to death threats. Oh, the sophisticated weaponry, you'll be shot from a distance. Oh, you'll be sued. Oh, all sorts of things. Just to keep, to say, keep your mouth shut. What has happened? In the end, it has become everybody's initiative. Because in the end, it starts to make sense. So we learn from the past. We learn from the past. We learn from the people that have been there. We learn from those people. And then we start to plan. When you plan, it's called a moving plan. Right? This is what I call it. It's a moving plan. It's a plan that's flexible, that's adaptable. It's a plan that can be adapted by anybody. And thus it has become a universal plan. And it's a plan to reduce pressure by first targeting one thing before moving on to the next. So, deadline. The deadline, if anything, is going to show how outdated systems are and how those systems end up making people incompetent in what they do. And the president-elect doesn't take nonsense. And the president-elect has a no-nonsense team. Thus, there is going to be a lot of innovation. There is going to be more reducing than increasing. That means reducing time that it takes to do certain things, to complete certain tasks, and so forth. Deadlines. Crucial.